The wind on Korath 7 carried more than just ice crystals. It carried the ghosts of 1,000 broken dreams, the echoes of mining equipment that had fallen silent years ago, and today, something Marcus had never expected to hear in the abandoned outer districts, the soft whimper of a child. Marcus Reeves pulled his thermal coat tighter around his shoulders as he navigated the twisted metal corridors of Station Block 7. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, each exhalation a reminder of how hostile this place had become since the mining corporation pulled out. The corridors that once buzzed with workers now stood empty, their walls coated with a thin layer of frost that never seemed to melt. He'd been salvaging here for 3 years, ever since his contract as a geological surveyor had been terminated. Along with half the planetary workforce, the pay was gone. The transports had stopped coming. But Marcus had stayed. Something about the solitude appealed to him. Or maybe he'd just grown too stubborn to admit defeat. Either way, the abandoned stations provided enough salvageable materials to keep his small shelter running. And his belly barely full, his portable scanner beeped softly, indicating a cache of copper wiring behind a collapsed maintenance panel. Marcus knelt, pushing aside chunks of concrete and twisted metal sheeting. The work was methodical, familiar. Copper wire meant another week of power for his heating unit. Thermal gel cartridges meant warmth through the next ice storm. It was a simple equation. Find, salvage, survive. But today, the equation changed. The sound came again. Faint but unmistakable, a child's cry, thin and desperate, carried on the recycled air currents. Marcus froze, scanner still in hand. He'd been alone out here for so long that part of him wondered if his mind was finally playing tricks on him. But the sound repeated, clearer now, coming from deeper in the complex. He followed the noise through a maze of fallen support beams and emergency lighting that flickered weakly from backup power cells. The temperature dropped another few degrees. As he moved away from the main ventilation shaft, his boots crunched on frost-covered debris, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with the slow, steady rhythm of melting ice. The crying led him to what had once been a communal rest area. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and patches of insulation hung from the walls like tattered cloth. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an overturned table, Marcus saw them. 2 children huddled together in the shadows. The older one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 9, had her arms wrapped protectively around what appeared to be an infant. Both had the distinctive pale blue skin and silver hair of the Zolani species, refugees from a planet that had been strip-mined to death decades ago. Their clothing was a patchwork of salvaged materials, thermal blankets held together with wire, fabric scraps bound around their feet in place of proper shoes. The girl looked up as Marcus approached, and he saw her eyes, large, luminous, with the faint bioluminescent quality that marked her heritage. But there was no light in them now, just exhaustion and a desperate kind of hope that had been worn thin by too many disappointments. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient hum of failing life support systems. "Just a little food for my family, mister." Her thin fingers clutched a cracked feeding bottle, empty and dry. "I'll repay your kindness tenfold when I'm grown." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. This child, this tiny being who should have been playing with toys or learning to read, was making promises about a future she might not live to see. The baby in her arms, her brother, he assumed, was so still that for a terrifying moment, Marcus wondered if they were too late. Marcus knelt slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. Up close, he could see the signs of prolonged malnutrition, the hollow cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her small frame, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of weakness rather than cold. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Kira," she replied, then glanced down at the bundle in her arms. "This is Nex. He's very quiet now." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The infant's breathing was shallow but steady, alive, but barely. His pale blue skin had an unhealthy translucent quality, and his tiny fists were curled weakly against his sister's chest. "How long have you been out here alone?" Kira's eyes darted away, as if admitting the truth might make it more real. 12 days, she whispered. "Maybe 13. I stopped counting when the water ran out. 12 days. 2 children, alone in sub-zero temperatures, with no food, no heat, no protection except what they could scavenge from the ruins. The fact that they were still alive was nothing short of miraculous. Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out an emergency nutrition bar, one of only 3 he had left. He unwrapped it slowly and broke off a small piece, offering it to Kira. She stared at it as if it were made of precious metal. "Take it," he said gently. "You need to eat." Her hand shook as she reached for the food, and Marcus saw tears forming in her luminous eyes. She took a tiny bite, then immediately tried to push the rest toward her brother's lips. "He needs it more," she said. "He needs you strong first," Marcus replied. "Eat." "There's more where that came from." It was a lie. His supplies were running dangerously low, but the hope that flickered in Kira's eyes made the deception worthwhile. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. While she ate, Marcus assessed their situation. The children needed immediate medical attention, proper nutrition, and warmth. His shelter was a 20-minute walk through the frozen corridors, but it had heat, food, and basic medical supplies. The question was whether they were strong enough for the journey. "Kira," he said carefully, "I have a warm place not far from here. Food, medicine, everything you need. But we have to walk there. Can you manage that?" She nodded immediately, though. Marcus could see the effort it cost her to project strength she didn't have. "I can carry him," she said, adjusting her grip on her brother. "I know you can," Marcus said, "but let me help." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around both children. The cold bit into his arms through his thin shirt, but seeing Kira's face relax slightly as warmth enveloped her made the discomfort irrelevant. He lifted necks carefully, noting how the infant's breathing seemed to ease in the warmth of the coat. "Can you walk if I carry him?" Marcus asked. Kira nodded, though her legs shook as she stood. Marcus offered her his free hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were ice cold and thin as twigs, but her grip was surprisingly strong. The journey back to his shelter felt endless. Kira stumbled several times, her energy flagging with each step, but she never complained. She just squeezed Marcus's hand tighter and kept walking. The baby remained worryingly quiet, though his breathing seemed to strengthen slightly in the relative warmth of the coat. Marcus's shelter was built into the remains of an old processing station. He'd reinforced the walls, installed a functioning heater, and managed to rig up basic amenities from salvaged equipment. It wasn't much, but it was warm, dry, and safe. As they approached the heavy metal door, Marcus felt Kira slow behind him. He turned to see her staring at the entrance with a mixture of hope and fear. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe now." The door hissed open, releasing a wave of warm air that made both children blink in surprise. Marcus guided them inside, sealing the door behind them. The interior was Spartan but functional. A single room with a bed, a small kitchenette, storage units, and most importantly, a heater that filled the space with blessed warmth. Kira stood just inside the door, still holding Marcus's hand, staring around the space as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Marcus quickly prepared a makeshift bed near the heater, using every spare blanket and thermal pad he could find. He laid necks down gently, then helped Kira settle beside her brother. For the first time in what was probably weeks, both children were truly warm. "Rest," Marcus said, pulling another blanket over them. "I'm going to prepare some food." As he worked in the small kitchen area, heating synthetic milk for the baby and preparing a mild broth for Kira, Marcus found himself thinking about the choice he'd just made. He had enough supplies for maybe another month on his own, with 2 additional mouths to feed, especially one as young as Nex. Those supplies wouldn't last 2 weeks. But looking at the children, Kira's eyes finally closing in peaceful sleep, Nex's breathing growing stronger in the warmth, Marcus realized he'd never made an easier decision in his life. Tomorrow he'd worry about supplies. Tonight, 2 children who had asked for nothing but a little food were finally safe outside. The wind continued to howl through the abandoned corridors of Korath 7, but inside the small shelter, for the first Time and years, Marcus Reeves wasn't alone. And somehow, despite the logical voice in his head warning him about dwindling resources and impossible circumstances, that felt like exactly where he was supposed to be. Marcus woke to the sound of whispered singing. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything he'd ever heard. A lullaby in the Zalani language that seemed to resonate through his bones. He opened his eyes and saw Kira sitting beside her brother, gently stroking his hair as she sang. Nex was awake, his large eyes tracking his sister's movements. The color had returned to his pale blue cheeks, and he was making soft cooing sounds that Marcus took as a good sign. The nutrition supplements and warmth had worked faster than he'd dared hope. "Good morning," Marcus said softly, not wanting to startle them. Kira looked up, and for the first time since he'd found them, she smiled. It was tentative, fragile, but genuine. "He's better," she said. "Much better. Thank you." Marcus prepared breakfast, reconstituted protein porridge for Kira and warmed synthetic milk for Nex. As they ate, he noticed Kira glancing toward the door every few minutes, her expression alternating between hope and worry. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked gently. Kira's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She looked down at her bowl, then back at the door. "Maybe," she whispered. "She said she'd come back when it was safe. Our mother. Her name is Vera." Kira's voice grew even softer. "She had to leave us to keep us safe from the bad man." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's ambient temperature. "What bad man?" Before Kira could answer, a soft sound came from outside, barely audible over the hum of the life support systems, but distinct enough to make them all freeze. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, approaching the shelter. Marcus moved to the door's security panel, checking the external sensors. A single heat signature showed on the display. Humanoid, adult-sized. Moving slowly toward the entrance, the figure stopped just outside the range of the door sensors. As if afraid to come closer, Kira had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the door. "Mama," she whispered. Marcus looked at the readings again. Whoever was outside had been standing in the freezing corridor for several minutes, just beyond the sensor range, watching, waiting. "Stay here," he told Kira softly, then moved to the manual door controls. Instead of opening the door fully, he cracked it just enough to peer outside. The figure in the corridor was tall and lean, wrapped in layers of tattered thermal cloth that had seen far better days. Silver hair hung in tangled strands around a face that bore the same luminous features as the children, but where Kira's eyes held innocence touched by hardship, this woman's gaze was haunted by something far darker. She stood barefoot on the frozen metal floor, her skin showing signs of prolonged exposure to the cold. Her posture was rigid with tension, ready to run at the first sign of threat. When she saw Marcus in the doorway, her entire body went taut. "My children," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality as Kira's, but roughened by exhaustion and fear. "Are they? They're safe," Marcus said immediately. "Alive, warm, fed." The woman's knees nearly buckled with relief. She pressed one hand against the corridor wall to steady herself, and Marcus could see her shoulders shaking, whether from cold, exhaustion, or emotion. He couldn't tell. "I heard Kira singing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching for 2 days, trying to decide if it was safe to approach." Marcus finished. He opened the door wider, stepping back. "It is. Come inside." But the woman didn't move. She stared at the warm light spilling from the shelter, her expression a mixture of desperate longing and deep-seated fear. "I have nothing to trade," she said suddenly. "No payment. No services." The last word carried a weight of painful experience that made Marcus's stomach clench with understanding. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. "Men always want something." From inside the shelter, Kira's voice called out urgently, "Mama, please come inside. It's warm, and there's food, and he's kind. He doesn't want to hurt us." The woman's resolve cracked at her daughter's words. She took one hesitant step forward, then stopped again. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Vera." She wrapped her arms around herself, the motion making her makeshift clothing rustle. "I'm their mother. I left them to keep them safe." But then you came back, Marcus said simply. That's what matters. Vera looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of deception or hidden motive. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she finally stepped across the threshold. The moment she entered the warm space, her careful composure shattered. She saw her children, Kira running toward her with tears streaming down her face, Nex reaching up from his blankets with tiny hands, and fell to her knees, gathering them both into her arms. The reunion was silent except for soft Solani, words whispered against silver hair, and the sound of 3 hearts finding each other again. Marcus closed the door and gave them space, busying himself with preparing another meal. When the initial flood of emotion had passed, Vera looked up at him from where she knelt with her children. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us?" Marcus paused in his food preparation. It was a question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd heard Kira's plea. "Because someone should have," he said finally. "That's not enough of a reason. Is for me." Vera studied him with those luminous eyes, so similar to her daughter's, but filled with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," Marcus said, and meant it. "Just don't leave them alone again. They need you." Something in Vera's expression shifted. Not relaxation, exactly, but a subtle easing of the rigid tension she'd carried since entering. She nodded slowly. "I won't," she said. "Not unless. There won't be an unless." Marcus interrupted gently. "Not here. This is safe ground." As the day progressed, Vera gradually began to believe him. She ate the food he offered without flinching. When their hands briefly touched as he passed her the bowl, she allowed him to check Nex's condition without positioning herself between them. Most tellingly, she fell asleep that evening with her back to him, a sign of trust that spoke volumes about how desperate she'd been for a safe place to rest. Marcus stayed awake, watching over all 3 of them. Outside, the station systems hummed their mechanical lullaby, and the wind whistled through distant corridors. But inside the shelter, a fractured family was slowly beginning to heal. As he watched Vera sleep with her children curled against her, Marcus realized that his carefully ordered solitary existence had changed forever. These weren't just temporary refugees he was sheltering. Somehow, without meaning to, he'd become responsible for 3 lives that had wandered out of the frozen darkness and into his light. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he listened to the soft, synchronized breathing of the sleeping family, Marcus found himself hoping they would choose to stay. The screaming started in the early hours of the morning. Marcus jerked awake to find Vera thrashing in her sleep, silver hair plastered to her face with sweat, her body rigid with terror. Beside her, Kira was trying to wake her mother while shielding baby Nex from the violent movements. "Mama, wake up," Kira whispered urgently. "You're safe." "We're safe." Marcus approached carefully, not wanting to startle Vera further. Her eyes snapped open as he knelt beside the makeshift bed, and for a moment, he saw pure panic in their luminous depths, the look of someone who had learned to expect pain from every human contact. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're in the shelter. You're safe." Vera's breathing gradually slowed as she oriented herself. She looked around the warm room, taking in the familiar hum of the heater, the soft glow of the emergency lighting, her children safe beside her. The nightmare retreated, but its shadows lingered in her expression. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling Kira closer. "Did I frighten you?" Kira shook her head. Though Marcus could see the worry in her young face, it was the bad dream again. About Jackson. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Vera's entire body tensed, and Marcus saw her protective instincts flare to life. She gathered both children closer, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through. "Who's Jackson?" Marcus asked gently. Vera's jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "He was a traitor. Independent freight hauler who worked the Outer Rim stations. We were living in a refugee camp on Theta 9, barely surviving on aid rations and charity work." She stared at the floor as she spoke, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "Jackson said he could get us passage to the inner colonies. Said he knew people who would sponsor us for citizenship." Marcus felt his stomach clench. He'd heard stories like this before. desperate refugees taken advantage of by unscrupulous traders, who saw them as cargo rather than people. He seemed kind at first, Vera continued. Brought toys for the children, extra food, said we could work off the transport fees once we reached our destination. Her voice grew bitter. I was so desperate to give Kira and Nex a better life that I ignored every warning sign. Kira shifted closer to her mother, her small hand finding Vera's and squeezing tight. She'd heard this story before, Marcus realized. Probably lived through parts of it. The ship was a cargo hauler, Vera went on. Old, barely spaceworthy. But it wasn't until we were in hyperspace that I realized we weren't heading for the inner colonies. We were going deeper into the rim, to planets where there were no laws, no protection. Marcus waited, not wanting to push but sensing she needed to tell this story. Jackson said I owed him for passage, for food, for the space we occupied, said. There were ways I could work off the debt. Vera's hands clenched into fists when I refused. He threatened the children, said accidents happened in space all the time, especially to refugee families who didn't understand their place. The implications hung heavy in the air. Marcus felt a surge of anger toward this Jackson, whoever he was, but kept his expression neutral. Vera needed to tell this story without judgment or interruption. I did what I had to do to keep them safe, she said simply. For months, I submitted to whatever he wanted, convinced myself it was temporary, that once we reached our destination, we'd be free. But he never intended to let you go, Marcus said. Vera shook her head. The debt kept growing. Food, air, water, everything had a price that increased daily. And there were other things he demanded, things that had nothing to do with payment. She paused, steadying herself. When we finally reached Korath 7, he said we'd be staying, that he'd found buyers for workers in the mining stations. Buyers, Marcus repeated. The word tasting bitter. Contract labor, he called it. Indentured. Servitude with no end date. Vera's voice hardened with remembered fury. That's when I knew I had to get the children away from him. She told him about the escape, how she'd waited until Jackson was drunk on synthetic alcohol, then slipped away with Kira and baby Nex into the abandoned sections of the mining complex. How they'd survived for weeks on scraps and melted ice, always moving, always hiding. But he kept hunting us, Vera said. Jackson knew these stations better than I did. Every time we found a safe place to rest, he'd appear. So I made a choice, Marcus. Felt his chest tighten, sensing what was coming. I told Kira to take Nex and hide in the deepest part of the ruins. Told her I would lead Jackson away, that I'd come back for them when it was safe. Vera's voice broke slightly. I thought it would be a few days, maybe a week. How long were you gone? Marcus asked softly. 3 weeks, Vera whispered. 3 weeks of playing cat and mouse through the station levels, always staying just ahead of him, never letting him get close enough to track back to where I'd left them. Marcus tried to imagine those weeks, a mother's desperation driving her to stay away from her children, knowing they were starving and alone, all to keep them safe from something worse. What happened to Jackson? Vera's expression grew cold. He fell down a maintenance shaft during one of his searches, 40-meter drop onto solid metal. She met Marcus's eyes for the first time during the story. I didn't push him, but I didn't help him either. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus found he couldn't summon any sympathy for the traitor. Some people created their own justice through their actions. When I went back to find Kira and Nex, they were gone. Vera continued. I searched for days, terrified that Jackson had found them before his accident, or that they died while I was gone. Then I heard singing, Kira's voice, coming from this section. You've been watching us for 2 days, Marcus said, understanding now. I had to be sure. Vera said, had to know you weren't another Jackson, looking for vulnerable people to exploit. She looked around the warm shelter, at the children sleeping peacefully between them. I kept waiting for you to demand something, payment, gratitude, services, and when I didn't, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the galaxy. Vera's voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. People who help because it's right, not because they want something in return. Marcus reached over and gently adjusted Nex's blanket, the gesture automatic and caring. "There are more good people than you might think," he said. "You just had the misfortune to meet one of the bad ones first." Vera watched his gentle handling of her son, something shifting in her expression. "Kira was right about you," she said. "You really don't want anything, do you?" "I want you and the children to be safe," Marcus said simply. "I want Nex to grow up healthy and Kira to have the childhood she deserves. I want you to sleep without nightmares." He paused. "If that counts as wanting something, then yes, I want that." For the first time since she'd entered the shelter, Vera smiled. It was small, hesitant, but genuine. "That counts," she said. As the first light of Korath 7's pale sun filtered through the shelter's single window, Marcus realized that the story Vera had shared was more than just an explanation of their past. It was a gift of trust, offered by someone who had learned the hard way that trust was a precious and dangerous thing. Outside, the abandoned station continued its slow decay, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its forgotten corners. But inside the small shelter, something new was beginning to grow, not just healing from past wounds, but the first tentative roots of hope for a different kind of future. 2 weeks had passed since Vera's arrival, and the shelter had transformed from a survival outpost into something that almost resembled a home. Makeshift curtains divided the space into private areas, salvaged furniture created cozy corners, and the constant hum of conversation and laughter had replaced the sterile silence Marcus had grown accustomed to. Nex had grown stronger each day, his pale blue skin taking on a healthy luminescence that spoke of proper nutrition and warmth. He'd begun to babble in the melodic Zalani language, reaching for bright objects and responding to his family's voices with delighted squeaks. Watching him discover his own curiosity was like witnessing a flower bloom. And fast forward, Kira had blossomed too, but in different ways. The hollow-eyed desperation had faded from her face, replaced by the natural brightness of a child who no longer had to worry about her next meal or where she'd sleep. She'd appointed herself Marcus's assistant in all things, following him around the shelter and asking endless questions about how everything worked. "Why does the heater make that clicking sound?" she asked one morning as Marcus performed routine maintenance on the unit. "The thermal regulator expands when it heats up," he explained, handing her a small tool. "Metal grows when it gets warm and shrinks when it cools down." Kira considered this with the seriousness of a scholar, like how Mama's hair gets curlier when it's humid. Marcus glanced over at Vera, who was preparing Nex's morning feeding. Her silver hair had indeed begun to curl slightly as the shelter's humidity levels stabilized, and she'd taken to braiding it loosely to keep it out of her face while she worked. The simple change made her look younger, less haunted. "Something like that," he agreed, smiling at the comparison. As the days had passed, Marcus had watched Vera gradually relax. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased, and she no longer startled every time he moved too quickly or spoke unexpectedly. She'd begun to hum while she worked, Zalani melodies that filled the shelter with an alien beauty Marcus had never experienced before. But it was the small gestures that spoke loudest of the trust growing between them. The way she no longer positioned herself between him and the children. How she'd begun asking his opinion on small decisions, rather than simply accepting whatever he offered. The morning she'd quietly moved her sleeping area closer to his, not for protection, but for companionship. "Marcus," she said softly that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from the supply inventory he'd been updating. They were running low on several essentials, but trade expeditions to other settlements were always possible. The question was whether to leave the family alone or risk taking them along. "Of course." Vera settled beside him on the small bench he'd fashioned from salvaged materials. She was close enough that he could smell the faint, sweet scent that seemed to be natural to her species, like flowers blooming in snow. "Why have you never asked about my husband?" she said. "Kira and Nex's father." Marcus set down his data pad. It was a question he'd wondered about, but hadn't felt was his place to ask. "I figured if it was important, you'd tell me." "He died," Vera said simply. "Lung fever. During the evacuation of our home world. Kira barely remembers him, and Nex never knew him at all." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Vera's voice was matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Dallin was a good man, but he's been gone for 3 years. I've had time to grieve." She paused, studying her hands. "What I never had time for was figuring out who I am beyond being someone's wife or someone's victim." Marcus waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. "These past weeks, living here with you, it's the first time since Dallin died that I felt like myself again. Not just a mother trying to keep her children alive, not just a refugee, grateful for scraps, just me." "And who is that?" Marcus asked gently. Vera looked up at him, her luminous eyes reflecting the soft glow of the emergency lighting. "I'm still figuring that out. But I know she's someone who laughs at Kira's terrible jokes about mechanical parts. Someone who enjoys teaching next new words in both our languages. Someone who likes the way you hum while you work, even though you probably don't realize you do it." Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the shelter's heating system. "I hum all the time," Vera said, smiling. "Usually old survey expedition songs. Very off-key. My musical talents were never my strong suit. I like it anyway." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "I like a lot of things about you." Marcus Reeves. The air between them shifted, charged with possibilities that neither had dared acknowledge before. Marcus found himself studying the delicate structure of her face, the way her silver hair caught the light, the gentle curve of her mouth as she spoke. "Vera," he said softly. "I know," she replied, as if reading his thoughts. "I feel it too." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken feelings settling between them like a bridge being built one beam at a time. "I don't want to rush anything," Marcus said finally. "You've been through so much, and I don't want you to feel like you owe me." "Stop," Vera interrupted, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "This isn't about debt or gratitude. This is about choice, my choice, freely made, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Marcus looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. What are you choosing?" Instead of answering with words, Vera leaned forward and pressed her lips softly to his. The kiss was tentative at first, questioning, then deeper as Marcus responded. When they broke apart, both were breathing a little harder. "I'm choosing this," she whispered. "I'm choosing you, if you'll have me." Marcus cupped her face gently in his hands, marveling at the trust it took for her to make herself vulnerable after everything she'd endured. "I've wanted to ask you to stay," he said. "Not just for shelter, not just for safety, but because somewhere, in the past few weeks, this stopped being my shelter and became our home." Vera's smile was radiant. "Then ask me." "Stay," Marcus said simply. "Stay because you want to. Stay because this is where you belong. Stay because I—" He stopped, the words too big and too important to rush. "Because you what?" Vera prompted, softly. "Because I love you," he finished. "All of you. You and Kira and Nex. I love the family we've become." Vera's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I thought I'd forgotten how to love anything besides my children, but you've reminded me there's room for more in my heart." They kissed. Again, longer this time, with the knowledge that this was no longer a temporary arrangement, but the beginning of something permanent and precious. From across the room, Kira's sleepy voice broke the moment. "Are you and Mama going to get married?" Both adults turned to see the 9-year-old sitting up in her bed, her silver hair tousled with sleep and her expression hopeful. "Were you listening to our private conversation?" Vera asked with mock sternness. We're being very loud whisperers," Kira replied matter-of-factly. "So are you?" Marcus and Vera looked at each other, then burst into quiet laughter. Some conversations, it seemed, couldn't be contained by whispers. "Would you like that?" Marcus asked Kira. "Very much," she said solemnly. "You make Mama smile, the way she used to, before everything got scary. And you're teaching me how to fix things instead of just breaking them." "And what about you being my daughter?" Marcus asked. "Really my daughter, not just someone I'm taking care of." Kira's face lit up with pure joy. "Can I call you Papa?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'd be honored." As Kira settled back into sleep with a contented sigh, Marcus and Vera remained close together on the bench. planning a future that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Outside, Korath 7's frozen winds continued their eternal howl through the abandoned stations, but inside their small refuge, love had taken root and was growing into something that could weather any storm. 6 months later, the shelter had expanded into a proper homestead. Marcus had salvaged materials from 3 additional station modules, creating separate bedrooms, a larger common area, and even a small workshop where he taught Kira the finer points of mechanical repair. Solar collectors powered improved heating and lighting systems, and a hydroponic garden provided fresh vegetables to supplement their stored rations. But the most significant change wasn't structural. It was the laughter that echoed through the corridors daily, the sense of purpose that drove every improvement, and the quiet contentment that had settled over their unconventional family like a warm blanket. Nex had grown into a chattering toddler who spoke in a delightful mixture of Standard and Zolani, calling Marcus Papa with the same ease he said Mama. His first steps had been taken across the workshop floor, reaching for a shiny wrench that Marcus had deliberately placed just out of his grasp. The celebration that followed had lasted well into the evening. Kira had become Marcus's unofficial apprentice, her quick mind grasping mechanical concepts with startling speed. She'd successfully repaired a broken water reclamation unit the previous week, earning Marcus's genuine praise and Vera's proud tears. More importantly, she'd begun talking about when I'm older and we expand the homestead rather than if I survive to grow up. But it was Vera's transformation that took Marcus's breath away daily. The haunted refugee had blossomed into a confident woman who sang while she cooked, who offered opinions freely in their planning discussions, and who had taken charge of expanding their small garden into something approaching self-sufficiency. Her laughter came easily now, and the nightmares had faded to occasional whispers rather than screaming terrors. The tomatoes are coming in beautifully, she announced one morning, carrying a basket of red fruit into the main living area. We'll have enough to preserve some for winter. Marcus looked up from the star charts he'd been studying. Trade routes to nearby settlements had become more important as their little family grew and required more resources. That's wonderful. Any word from the Hendersons about trading surplus vegetables for protein supplements? They're interested, Vera said, settling beside him on their expanded seating area, especially in the root vegetables, apparently. Kira's suggestion about the nutrient cycling has tripled their yield. Marcus smiled. The Hendersons were another family they'd made contact with, living in a converted mining station about 50 kilometers away. The growing network of families and individuals scattered across Korath 7's abandoned infrastructure had begun forming a loose community, trading resources and information. Speaking of trade, Vera continued, her tone shifting to something more serious. There's something we need to discuss. Marcus set down the charts, giving her his full attention. What is it? Marcus Thompson came by yesterday while you were working on the water pumps. He had news from the inner colonies. Marcus Thompson was their closest neighbor, a former mining engineer who'd established a small trading post in a refurbished cargo bay. He made regular trips to the system's more populated worlds, bringing back news and supplies in exchange for salvaged materials. What kind of news? Vera hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small data chip. A colonial development company has purchased mining rights to this system. They're planning to reestablish operations within the next 2 years. Marcus felt his stomach clench. Corporate mining operations meant corporate security, corporate rules, and corporate interest in anyone operating without proper documentation or permits. Their quiet refuge would become very complicated very quickly. How long do we have? He asked. 18 months, maybe 24 if the bureaucracy moves slowly. Vera's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. They'll want to catalog all existing infrastructure, document any inhabitants, establish proper legal frameworks. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, mind racing through possibilities. We could relocate, find somewhere more remote, with 2 young children and everything we've built here. Vera shook her head. Besides, running didn't work so well for us before. Then what do you suggest? Vera leaned forward, her expression determined. We legitimize ourselves, File for homestead rights under the Colonial Settlement Act. Establish legal claim to this section before the development company arrives. Marcus blinked. He'd never considered the legal aspects of their situation, having operated outside official channels for so long that he'd forgotten they existed. Is that possible? Marcus has been researching it. The act allows for retrospective homestead claims as long as the claimants can demonstrate continuous habitation, infrastructure development, and sustainable resource management. Vera's smile was slightly fierce. We qualify on all counts. What about documentation? Citizenship status. You're still legally a Terran citizen. Just one who failed to report a change of address, Vera said dryly. As for me and the children, there are provisions for refugee families to gain citizenship through marriage to existing colonists. The word marriage hung in the air between them. They'd talked about formalizing their relationship, but had been content with the simple reality of their commitment to each other and their family. Legal recognition had seemed irrelevant in their isolated existence. Are you proposing to me, Vera Kane? Marcus asked with a slight smile. I'm proposing we get married for extremely practical reasons, she replied. Then her expression softened. The fact that I love you desperately and want to spend the rest of my life with you is just a pleasant bonus. Marcus laughed, pulling her into his arms. In that case, yes, yes to marriage. Yes to homestead rights. Yes to making this official in every way that matters. Their kiss was interrupted by Kira's voice from the workshop doorway. Are you two being mushy again? We're planning your future, young lady, Vera called back, which involves a wedding, legal paperwork, and probably a baby brother or sister eventually. Can I be the mechanic at the wedding? Kira asked seriously, in case anything breaks. Marcus and Vera looked at each other and burst into laughter. Only their daughter would think a wedding might require mechanical repairs. Yes, Marcus said solemnly, you can be the official wedding mechanic. 3 months later, the paperwork was filed, the homestead claim was registered, and Marcus Reeves married Vera Kane in a simple ceremony attended by their growing network of neighbors and friends. Kira did indeed serve as the wedding mechanic, though her services weren't required. Next provided entertainment by babbling happily throughout the proceedings and trying to eat the makeshift bouquet Vera had assembled from their garden. As they settled into married life with legal recognition of their family status, Marcus often found himself thinking about that first morning when he'd heard a child's cry echoing through the abandoned corridors. He'd been a man living in exile from his own life, convinced that solitude was preferable to the complications of human connection. Now, watching Vera teach next new words in both languages, while Kira worked on a complex wiring project, Marcus understood that he'd been wrong about almost everything. Solitude wasn't safety, it was just another kind of prison. Family wasn't a burden to be avoided. It was the thing that made all other struggles worthwhile. Papa, Kira said one evening as they worked together on expanding the workshop's power systems. Do you ever miss being alone? Marcus considered the question seriously. I thought I would, he said finally, but it turns out I was never really alone. I was just waiting for you all to find me. Kira nodded solemnly, then broke into the gap-toothed grin that never failed to make his heart skip. Good thing Mama taught me how to ask nicely for things. Otherwise, you might not have helped us. Oh, I would have helped, Marcus said, ruffling her silver hair. The asking nicely just made it easier for everyone. That night, as Marcus lay beside his wife with their children sleeping peacefully nearby, he listened to the familiar sounds of their home, the hum of life support systems, the whisper of recycled air, the soft breathing of his family. Outside, Korath 7's winds still howled through the abandoned ruins, carrying the echoes of dreams that had died with the mining operations. But inside their expanded shelter, new dreams were taking root, dreams of watching Nex take his first steps beyond their walls, of teaching Kira to pilot the atmospheric craft Marcus was slowly rebuilding, of growing old with Vera in a home they'd built with their own hands and filled with their own love. The starving alien girl who had whispered desperately for just a little food had become his daughter. The broken mother who had offered herself in payment had become his wife and partner. The dying infant had become a thriving child who called him Papa with absolute trust. And Marcus Reeves, former geological surveyor and professional hermit, had become exactly what he'd never known he wanted to be: a father, a husband, and the anchor point around which a family's love could safely orbit. In the end, that was worth more than all the copper wire and thermal gel in the galaxy.